Hey everyone, Jeremy here. As you know, I'm the host of the podcast and a member of the team at the Sharpest Minds Data Science Mentorship Program. And I'm really excited about today's episode of the podcast because it's our first chance really to dive deep into the issue of AI ethics. AI ethics obviously is something that is in the air today. A lot of people are talking about it, certainly a lot more people than used to. It's increasingly important as machines start to take over really more and more of our collective cognition as a species. We're outsourcing more and more of our thinking to machines. And as we do that, it's becoming important for us to start reflecting on how we do that and whether or not we should be doing that in certain areas. And so the field of AI ethics emerged around questions like that. And one of the dominant voices in that field has been that of Dr. Annette Zimmermann, who is, I'm very excited to say, our guest for today's episode of the podcast. Now, technically, Annette calls herself a political philosopher, but I actually think that title sort of hides some of the intricacies of her thinking. She's in reality one part an ethicist, one part a philosopher, and then one part a technologist. I mean, she actually has to know an awful lot about engineering, data science, and artificial intelligence in terms of how systems are deployed and how they're built in order to be able to offer up her opinion and her insights on the field at large. AI ethics really is this marriage of different subspecialties, and she's really got them all on lock, and you'll see that on full display during the conversation. I should also mention that Annette has an awful lot of experience talking about and thinking about AI ethics and related issues. She's currently a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard University, and in addition to that, she's also a lecturer at York University. So she's really seen this stuff at the forefront of academia. She's also done applied research and written a whole bunch about this topic in a whole bunch of different popular publications. So you can definitely check those out. We'll be linking those in the description of the video as well as in the blog post that'll come with the podcast. So I hope you enjoy listening to the episode as much as I did recording it. This is definitely one of those episodes that I'd love to do more of in the future, and so we'll be having more people on to discuss things like AI bias and AI ethics for sure going forward. In the meantime, enjoy the show. Hi, Annette. Thanks so much for joining us for the podcast.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on. I think it's fair to say you're one of the guests I've been most excited to talk to because of the breadth of your interests and just how focused you are on this idea of AI ethics. I think AI ethics is obviously getting more and more important. I think it's already incredibly important. But I also don't think that many people, myself included, have a complete sense of what AI ethics really is. So maybe that's a good place to start. What is AI ethics?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to diagnose a kind of state of confusion in public debate around this topic at the moment. So I think a lot of people disagree about what AI ethics really is and whether it's useful in any way. From where I stand, so that's the kind of perspective of a trained philosopher, I would view ethics as the kind of discipline that tries to identify how society should work. So how should we distribute power? How should we arrange our social and political institutions? How ought we to act when we engage with other people? What do we owe to other people as a matter of morality? Now, of course, that's a very particular way of framing ethics. There are a lot of other people who do AI ethics, but who basically view ethics as something like a legal compliance framework or something like a kind of corporate aspiration, a corporate articulation of values. So a lot of big tech companies are putting out AI ethics principles at the moment. And very often they also take the form of a statement that says you ought to do X, Y, Z. So for instance, do no harm. And that's relevantly similar to what a philosopher might say, but it's often much less focused on a kind of non-commercial motive. So obviously big tech has a kind of commercial incentive to articulate these principles. I do think that very often they are articulated in good faith, but I think we need to think critically about them because very often they're non-binding principles, right? So it's very easy to put out a kind of voluntary statement of what we would like to do ideally, but if there's no accountability mechanism in place, and if you're the one who can set the agenda because you have a lot of computational power behind you and a lot of resources, then the question is, well, what does AI ethics really amounts to? And so I think that really explains why a lot of people are quite skeptical of AI ethics, because it just seems really toothless and kind of voluntaristic. Sorry, just to add to that, so I think that skepticism is right, but I don't think we should therefore conclude that we should throw AI ethics out of the window. So I do think that AI ethics, properly construed, can be a good tool to reason our way through what we ought to do, not only as members of big tech corporations, but also as members of society at large. So how should I, as an ordinary citizen, think about the ways in which we use AI and ML in really high stakes decisions in many different domains, given that AI is now replacing a lot of human decision makers in our public institutions, for instance. And so thinking about those questions morally and politically, which is what AI ethics in its good form is supposed to do, that I think is really valuable. So we shouldn't ditch that effort.
I find that fascinating, partly because of what it revealed about my priors. So, when I think about AI ethics, I think I'm joined here by probably the majority of people. I do think of these, like you said, the big ethics statements put out by Google and Facebook and so on. And I guess to some degree that also reflects the asymmetry in terms of both knowledge and resources that these companies have to even experiment with these technologies. I mean, it feels like there's a sense in which governments are playing catch up on a regular basis. And
Absolutely.
all the cutting edge technologies being developed in-house at big tech firms, which therefore can lay claim to kind of being at the edge of not just the technology, but also the ethics. Is there something in your research focus or some thinking you've done around the question of like, how do we bring kind of social decision making at a broader level, a higher level of abstraction maybe that isn't confined to just companies and enterprises? How do we get that into the game if the resources are constrained and the knowledge is too?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to diagnose the core problem that we're facing at the moment. Right now, there aren't really very much incentives for really talented ML programmers to work in the public sector or to stay in research. Obviously, there are a lot of incentives in favor of going into the corporate domain. And so for that reason, it is true that a lot of talent is in private industry at the moment. The question is, should that mean that big tech corporations get to set the ethical agenda on top of setting the technological agenda? And agenda setting, of course, is a kind of key democratic problem, right? So democratic decision making isn't only about making actual choices, it's also about deciding together what we should be thinking about in the first place. So which kinds of solutions are we even considering in our decision making? And so that's where I think decision making on AI should and could feasibly trickle down into normal democratic discourse. So of course, a lot of people in government don't understand much about emerging technologies. And I think that explains a kind of widely shared reluctance to put these kinds of AI-related issues on democratic agendas. But at the end of the day, if you think about the ethical and political stakes of using many of these kinds of tools, ultimately they're not purely technical, and you can explain them to ordinary citizens in ways that aren't, reliant on having done an applied mathematics or applied statistics degree. So for instance, if we think about a system like COMPASS, so a criminal recidivism risk scoring tool, that obviously attracted a lot of controversy because as investigative journalists at ProPublica found out, it had massive racial disparities. So it failed worse for Black defendants. And so that seems like a clear ethical and political problem. And so if you explain that to people, you might say, well, one policy goal we might have in this area is to just improve this algorithm, right? So we could try to optimize it to get rid of this kind of racial disparity. And so the hope is that will make that system more fair. That's something that you can explain to an ordinary citizen. You might then follow that up, of course, with the statement, well, computer scientists have actually shown us that optimizing that kind of algorithm perfectly is very, very hard / impossible. So a lot of computer scientists have articulated impossibility theorems that relate to optimizing for many different kinds of fairness that are all individually plausible at the same time. So we can't be perfect when we mitigate and optimize the algorithmic systems.
And is that this has always struck me to be a feature of machine learning that starts to force us to really confront our philosophical lacuna. I mean, the areas where we lack in philosophy. Machine learning, in some sense, really forces us to codify in equations, in really concrete terms, what our moral philosophy is in a context where we really don't know. Like you just alluded to these no-go theorems and possibility theorems. You can't have privacy at the same time as you have a certain level of performance or whatever, and these things are in conflict. I mean, there seems to be similar issues even just with the concept of, for example, democracy, where we have not just things like tyranny of the masses or whatever, but other more fundamental constraints like Arrow's impossibility theorem. Even like there are no-go theorems in terms of like how well you can generalize knowledge from individuals into collectives. Is this like, do you see these as kind of being along the same continuum? Like, is this really one big problem, or is there a sense in which we can actually like divide meaningfully between the machine learning part of the problem and then the social part of the problem?
I think a lot of these questions are part of a structurally similar problem. So I think when people think about AI, they're really hyper-focused on identifying really unique features of AI, because obviously people are really excited about AI and ML at the moment. But as you just suggested, very many collective decision-making scenarios are actually structured in a similar way, where it becomes very hard to optimize fully. And so then the question for us as democratic citizens is, well, if we know that we'll fail to some extent, how do we want to fail, right? So do we want that failure to disproportionately burden people who are already disadvantaged? Or can we find a different way of dealing with imperfection and harm and uncertainty? So I think the worst possible case, which unfortunately has been realized in many domains recently, is that in fact, imperfections and harms and injustices compound for exactly those people who have already been at the receiving end of those injustices and harms. And so that seems fundamentally antithetical to democratic values. So if we really care about equal freedom for all, then that's the one case that we should absolutely avoid. And so, as you say, we find that in many other domains of democratic decision-making that actually don't have anything to do with AI. As soon as we're dealing with social complexity, we're gonna find ourselves in that kind of problem space.
I guess to some degree, this almost belies the fact that human beings themselves are machine learning agents in some meaningful sense. I mean, we have a neural network. We have some kind of reinforcement learning circuitry. Yeah, so what are some of the more on the, I don't want to say the more concrete side, but what are some of the strategies that you see as most promising in terms of dealing with some of these problems where we start to really entrench current norms, whatever they may be, in our algorithms?
Well, there is one very concrete but very controversial strategy, which is non-deployment in targeted domains. So a lot of people recently have been focused on non-deployment of facial recognition technology in particular, again, because of the racially disparate impact of that technology. And actually a lot of big tech corporations have now said, okay, we're gonna have a moratorium here. We're not gonna deploy these tools for a set amount of time. So IBM, Amazon, but also many others have kind of responded to pressure by researchers like Joy Buolamwini and others. And so clearly there's a kind of public awareness that actually limited and targeted non-deployment may be the best way to deal with these kinds of problems until we have a better technological solution to kind of attack these problems. Now, whether there always will be a feasible technological solution, that I think really depends on the domain of deployment, and it really depends on our goals. So think back to that other case that I mentioned before, that Compass case. If you look at that case, you might think, well, why are we predicting recidivism risk rates for people in the first place? Is that really the best way of ensuring that our criminal justice system works optimally, right? And what would that mean? So I guess another alternative we could put on our agenda, our democratic decision-making agenda, would be to say, well, couldn't we transform prisons? Couldn't we have institutional and social and structural and legal changes, changing sentencing guidelines, changing mandatory minimums? So all of these are possible solutions. Not all of them will be algorithmic. Some of them might be. But I think we need to get a really, really clear sense of the solution space in its entirety, and then contextualize AI approaches within that. And so that, I think, will help us identify where we should hold off on deploying something, maybe until we've tested technology and made it more reliable, or maybe as soon as we've deployed other social and institutional mechanisms, then it might be safer to deploy in that domain. But I think we really need to be attuned to this interplay between the social world and the technological world, because those will necessarily interact. And so that should guide our decision making about things like non-deployment.
Yeah, and you can really see, excuse me, you really see that temptation to like default to deploying when you have a problem, especially one that feels concrete, right? Like as an engineer, you can look at this problem and say, oh, there's a loss function I can define. Why don't I just like train and treat this as a Kaggle competition and go ahead and deploy? Whereas, yeah, this idea that actually you're dealing with a very complex system, the different parts interact. You can't really solve a sub problem without invoking other problems. It's really interesting. The non-deployment as its own option, really, in this whole situation.
Right, and I think it's really important not to fall into an optimization trap. So it's often funny for philosophers to engage with tech practitioners on this issue, because in philosophy, there's this well-known slogan called "odd implies can." So it just basically means that I can't impose a moral duty on you if it's just impossible for you to meet that duty. So that would be overly demanding, and so that wouldn't be ethical. But in the tech practitioner space, a lot of people turn that on its head. So they kind of say, can implies ought. So if I can do something, I should innovate, I should put it out there. So as you rightly say, there is a presumption in favor of putting things out there and seeing if they work, rather than thinking about, do we want this? What's our purpose with using this tool in the first place?
And so you've spoken as well about this idea of optimization as not being intrinsically necessarily a desirable not goal, but practice. Could you speak to that a little bit more? Like what's your thinking on that?
Right, so I think very often we view optimization as making incremental improvements. And so that's a really reasonable ad hoc view, right? So if you kind of think about, how can I improve my daily habits? Well, I'll do 5 minutes of this, and maybe I'll establish a routine of exercising daily or something, and over time I'll make these incremental improvements. So in life in general, I think that's a good principle. The problem is that very often in a machine learning space, when we make incremental improvements without asking, should we be optimizing in that direction in the first place, it can actually drive us further away from justice. So just to give you a very concrete example, think back to that facial recognition case that we just discussed. So before companies put out these non-deployment moratoriums, they actually had a different approach. So they said, well, we're just going to improve this technology. How do you do that? Well, you need more data. And in particular, in order to tackle the racial injustice problem that came to the forefront with these technologies, people in these corporations said, well, we need more data about Black and brown faces. And unfortunately, very often that process of gaining more data is very exploitative. So a Google subcontractor, for instance, went to the streets in LA and said to homeless people, let's play a game. We have the selfie game, we'll just record your face and, you get a $5 voucher. So they didn't tell these people that, their faces were being used as biometric data for facial recognition tools. So the community that is already quite vulnerable and probably will be at the receiving end of further injustices once this tool gets scaled up, that's exactly the community that was being used to optimize. And so I think that's a really good indicator that our effort of optimization puts us on a path that isn't really oriented towards greater justice. Because if the people who have to pay for that optimization or who have to provide some sort of services for optimization, if they're not actually taking ownership of that process, and if they're not being informed what is happening, then I think we're really on the wrong track. So that's a way in which incremental improvements actually end up burdening people further.
So I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole conversation, is this debate versus incrementalism versus some sort of almost first principles rethinking of the entire approach that we're taking to social structure and so on. To some degree, I mean, the political philosopher in me makes me think of the distinction between the two famous American political philosophers. There's Edmund Burke and there's Thomas Paine. Burke is sort of this classical conservative who says incrementalism is really the solution. We have decent structures that have evolved through time, through a combination of evolution and economics. We're now in a good place and we should respect that and not risk it. Whereas Thomas Paine says, well, and I think his words were like, we have it in our power to begin the world anew or something like that. really kind of rethinking the entire structure from first principles. Maybe Burke thinking a little bit more like an optimization engine, Thomas Paine thinking more like a physicist, come up with the equations from scratch, let's redo this and make a beautiful system. Is there the possibility, like, to take that Burkean position, take that gradualist position one step further and say, look, if they go out to the homeless people and they do this, obviously that's a huge mistake. What if they then take that information, iterate, try again? Is it possible that we just haven't tried that long enough? Is that a plausible sort of counter position to this idea?
So I think it, again, really depends on the domain. So I'm a big fan of iterative decision-making and critique approaches. I think very often that is really, really helpful and needed, mainly because a lot of technological problems actually only surface over time. So in many different domains, I can start out with a machine learning system that actually exhibits no bias, that is just, completely unobjectionable on the bias front, but where tiny incremental changes compound over time and end up still giving us massive disparities. So we know a similar phenomenon from human decision-making, actually. So think about the sociological phenomenon of belief polarization. So you can give two people exactly the same amount of data, the same amount of evidence, and depending on what their priors are, they're going to end up with really dramatically different views. And so it's kind of similar with machine learning systems. So contingencies in the social world, just random happenstances, may affect a path dependency in a system that isn't entirely foreseeable, and that we have to mitigate sequentially. And so that's why sequential intervention can be a really, really helpful tool for improving systems in a dynamic way. So that would then, again, bolster the case against a pure first principles approach. That being said, I think we do need some sort of reflection on what our overarching goal should be. So that can be a flexible articulation, but I think if we just say, we're going to be gradualists all the way down, then we might lose track of why we started trying to optimize something in the first place.
Right.
And so that kind of path dependency is something that I think we should be worried about. So there needs to be an approach that reconciles both of these ends of a spectrum with each other. And I think the way to do that is to have these first principle based conversations about what the goal definition should be, but then to iterate sequentially and be ready to change our goalposts if that is actually necessary.
So that's, I guess, a conversation. That's a good point. That's a conversation that's not even really happening at this point, or at least it doesn't feel like it's particularly happening outside of, I guess, pretty narrow areas like OpenAI and GovAI policy think tanks that are thinking about, like, what are these optimization processes? What are some of the big sort of discussion points in that ecosystem as people step back and ask themselves, what should we be building? Is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are tech practitioners are really interested in questions of personal responsibility. So one issue that I focused on recently was this Facebook employee who released the 6,000-word memo. I'm not sure if you followed the story, but essentially there was a person employed by Facebook who became increasingly concerned that she had a huge amount of professional responsibility. And according to her, she would see geopolitical responses to, minute decisions that she would make as part of her function at Facebook. And so this became so disconcerting to her that she tried to raise this within the company, but was met with backlash. And so the problem that she seemed to face was one where she wasn't able to adapt her behavior in a way to prevent these bad outcomes. So she, as an individual, was unable to prevent harm, right? Just because there was a surplus of power. And even if she had rejected that power, she would have still, been part of a really, really bad process, which is why she was then, critiquing the company and ultimately got fired for that. So that was a kind of less encouraging example of ethical deliberation happening among practitioners. But I did find it very interesting to see somebody articulate this very specific worry that one person might have too much power, right?
Yeah.
Because we often think about, an increase in responsibility as an honor or as an opportunity to do something really good. But I think the really necessary and really useful perspective that this person was bringing into the debate was, well, is there maybe a kind of sufficient degree of responsibility that one person shouldn't exceed? And again, I think that might ultimately be a democratic concern, right? So obviously, if we elect somebody into a position of massive power, then that person has to report back to us, technically, at least if things go well, why they do certain things, right? So they have to put themselves through the motion of justifying to us and explaining and rationalizing and arguing, which is something that Facebook engineer will never do with society at large. I mean, even if they try to get that process going within the company, it's not going to happen on the same kind of democratic scale. And so I think intuitively that worries people who want to do well with their work.
Yeah, and this, I mean, to some degree, this harks back to the conversation we were having earlier about democratic systems and their interaction with some of this technology. I guess to some degree, one of the problems is that the democratic process is just really, really slow. And as the rate of technological development increases, like, there may not actually be enough time for meaningful feedback, democratically speaking, to kind of be, circulate back to the decision makers, and that kind of tends to pile on and get away from us.
Right, yeah, I do think that it's a huge obstacle for AI policy in particular, that democratic institutions are, for good reason, designed to be robust, which slows them down. So there's a clear trade-off there. On the one hand, we want solid checks and balances, but on the other hand, we want responsiveness in our democratic institutions. And those can come apart exactly in these domains where we have a rapidly changing decision landscape. I would add here that democratic decision-making doesn't always have to mean electoral politics. That includes the entire democratic constituency. I think that's maybe the most obvious form of democratic decision-making, but maybe not even the most important one. So a lot of people are focused on domain experts in AI, for instance. And I think the choice about what constitutes expertise in this area might be really contestable.
Yeah.
Right? So very often when we think about medical AI innovations, we might be tempted to ask doctors. But we could also ask chronically ill people, right? I mean, it's not necessarily obvious which one of these choices might be better, or if a combination might actually yield more insightful results. Similarly, when we talk about AI deployed in criminal justice and policing contexts or immigration enforcement contexts, and we only have people in the room who serve on a police force, I think we're going to miss out on a really important perspective there. So I think we need to rethink who can be an expert in these discussions and whose voice we are valuing when we're trying to make really fast decisions. So it doesn't have to be comprehensive, but it does have to be a kind of reasoned and egalitarian thinking that helps us select these people.
And just for in the interest of kind of playing devil's advocate on the democracy side of things, because so one thing that at least has come to mind, especially as we start to see some of these developments in terms of increasingly sophisticated language models, GPT-3 and so on, when you look at the people who are currently in the AI ethics, AI alignment especially, but broadly sort of AI safety, AI policy ecosystem, I've always been struck in my conversations with them at just the almost absurd level of quality of these people and their integrity and the depth of thought. In which case, like, to the extent that that's true, it sparks the thought in me that it may not be immediately desirable to actually open this up to the full array, let's say, to put it nicely, of human behavior and pathology that we see on full display on things like Twitter, where people get into it. I mean, I can't imagine what those arguments might look like if they had to do with the performance of an algorithm that determined whether or not a person got a bank loan or something. I mean, it's kind of freaks me out to think about that. Is that, I don't know, is that something that you've been thinking about, like the extent to which closed systems that are sort of high trust and high specialization might have trade-offs with democratic open systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really, really central problem in political philosophy and also to some degree moral philosophy. So I think the problem that you're getting at here is justice and democracy could be orthogonal to each other, right? So I could have a democratic constituency that is just really anti-egalitarian or really divided, really hostile, or just doesn't really operate in good faith with each other anymore. And so that could taint democratic decision making in a way that actually doesn't care about justice and equality at all anymore. And that might also not care about decision quality at all, right? So it could just end up, with really terrible decision making that isn't grounded in any sort of facts anymore. And so that could be massively unjust and massively harmful for a lot of people. So I don't think we should conclude that democratizing AI will necessarily get rid of problems like algorithmic injustice. I certainly don't think that's true. I think a whole lot more is required to establish just forms of AI and machine learning, or otherwise ethically defensible forms of AI and machine learning.
And how mutable, oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I was just going to ask your thoughts on mutability of these moral frameworks. Like, there's a sense in which, we design algorithms, and by designing them, and certainly by deploying them, we do start, as you've said, to like enshrine some of these social norms, whether we do it with the awareness that that's what's happening or just implicitly. But then over time, obviously, we want our morality to shift. I mean, 50 years ago, interracial marriage was controversial. Certainly the way we treated homosexuality and so on has just been completely revolutionized. The idea that today we've landed on a set of satisfactory moral norms that's going to be static for all time is probably pretty shaky. Any ideas about how we might design systems that would have that kind of time domain flexibility?
Yeah, I think the first step to doing that would be to acknowledge that any choice we make is ethically and politically shaped in some way. So a lot of the time, I think we want to think of ourselves as making a totally ethically neutral decision, a purely technological decision. So for instance, when we decide exactly which features to select and measure when we design a system. And so at the face of it, that looks really neutral and objective because, we're just trying to represent facts and we're trying to abstract from those facts in order to come up with a generalizable decision rule. But at the end of the day, I can make many different choices about exactly what to look at, right? And so depending on what sort of story I want my model to tell, I'm going to get a kind of reinforcement effect from that. So if I decide to measure things like arrest rates, but actually I'm interested in coming up with a model that tells me a story about crime, I'm going to have a really imperfect story. And that story might start spinning out from reality more and more the less I acknowledge that actually I'm working with an imperfect approximation in data. And so the antidote, I think, to that is to always realize the degree of uncertainty that we're working with and the degree of choice dependency that we have in our design processes. So I think we shouldn't say, here's our static principle, let's try to get as close to that as possible one time, we're going to measure something once, and then we're just going to see what happens.
Yeah.
No, we have to return to that, and we have to ask, hang on, did we actually measure the right thing? Did we actually come up with the right decision rule? Why did we adopt that value in the first place? So it's not good to have a kind of shopping list in mind of values that we're trying to reach by making these ostensibly objective design decisions. I think we have to always be flexible, and that flexibility includes questioning our prior assumptions and our prior choices, as defensible as they might have seemed at that point. We need to be ready to completely change them if it turns out that they were deeply wrong.
Yeah, one of the things that looking at some of your work, your writing, and your YouTube videos as well, has kind of made clear, at least to me, that I hadn't fully appreciated yet, was the extent to which feature selection and feature engineering really amounts to choosing like the lens through which your algorithm will see the world. And like we know the effects of getting somebody to read, for example, like the New York Times over the course of a year versus getting somebody to read just Fox News over the course of a year. You're going to end up with two very different models of the world, because the dimensionality reduction, essentially the feature selection they've done on the world to present you with nominally the same events, but from different perspectives very often, completely changes the way you interpret things. It's kind of interesting to map that onto these algorithms and say, hey, if you actually just choose to feed this algorithm the equivalent of MSNBC or versus CNN, you will get a different algorithm with different conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's a really underappreciated dimension of untrustworthiness in AI. I think when you ask somebody, what would make AI trustworthy? their gut reaction is going to be something like, well, we want to ensure that AI doesn't make any egregious mistakes, right? So the kinds of mistakes that we've already discussed, right? So no egregious harm, no egregious injustice. But think about the kind of counterfactual to that, right? Like think about an AI system that actually hasn't really failed yet, right? It hasn't really betrayed our trust yet. Like we're kind of comfortable delegating to that system, either because we have uncertainty whether it'll perform well, or because we have some form of information about it that makes us reasonably confident that that system won't fail in certain ways. But then we still haven't excluded the possibility that the ontology of that system might just not be a faithful representation of the world as we want to represent it. Right? So that system might be idealizing in ways that we find alienating and weird and somehow not apt. And so that could be a totally different facet of untrustworthy AI that isn't actually that outcome dependent. It's a more process-based concern that we might have about AI. And the reason why I say it's process-based is I think we don't only care about doing the right thing, we also care about doing the right thing for the right reason. That's something that we would say about humans too. So if you had a friend who, routinely just does good things and, hasn't given you any reason to doubt, their loyalty to you, but then let's say you find out at some point that they just buy into a really, really weird reasoning structure. Like the whole reason why they were so nice to you as a friend was because they took pity on you and they thought, you really needed help and, you can't hack it on your own, but they feel no friendship towards you. If you find that out, you would say, oh God, all of the reasons why you did all of these nice things for me were terrible reasons and they're not in the spirit of friendship, right? So like you really missed what was going on here. And so I think a similar problem can arise with AI when AI is built on a weird and alienating ontology that just doesn't connect the right dots in the right way. And so that, in my mind, would make AI untrustworthy because you wouldn't have guarantees that it would continue to do right things because it doesn't do them for the right reason.
So does this, because I guess there's a countervailing philosophical position that says that the purpose of a system is what it does. So if a system does nice things to you, then it's a nice system independent of what's going on between its ears. I guess what you're really getting at though as well here is that ultimately there might be emergent behaviors that might not be obvious in the short term, but then all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, this thing was really just trying to look nice to gain my trust so that it could do something absolutely devastating, or is that a fair kind of assessment?
Yes, so it's true that the main worry that I'm getting at here is a long-term worry. I don't think we need to be necessarily assuming that AI in a really sophisticated form would be malicious. So I think it's very dangerous to anthropomorphize AI. So I'm not even imagining a kind of malicious AGI case here. I think these kinds of long-term problems can crop up even with narrow AI applications that themselves have weird ontologies, but that obviously don't pursue their own agendas because they're not, conscious agents.
So, okay, yeah, very interesting. All right, so what about, let me make the best steelman argument I can for some kind of objectivist framing of the AI problem. So let's say I want to get rid of the feature selection problem because I get that selecting features and engineering my own features is biased. It's going to reflect what I think is important and not what really is. Can I push this to the limit of what really is? Could I develop a system that is aware of the positions and momenta of every atom in, at the very least, like planet Earth or the solar system or something? And would that be more satisfactory? Would that at least get me past the hurdle of feature selection and feature engineering? Or am I still missing something even by doing something like that?
Well, it might get you around the problem of feature selection, but then I think you would be dealing with a different problem, which philosophers would call the benevolent dictator problem.
Right.
So again, this is a kind of thought experiment from political philosophy where, you imagine, what if you have a dictator that routinely does really amazing things, like a dictator who, rules well, who makes sure that everybody is treated equally, just, less equal than them. And so the question is, well, what's your complaint if things go well in that way for everybody? Let's say we have no reason to believe that that dictator will ever change their ways. We don't need to worry that they'll ever turn bad. But intuitively, we're still very worried about our total lack of control. And very often, I think as humans, we do have that need to be able to say, well, I have agency in this sort of interaction. And so I think if we had this really, 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 really sophisticated fine-grained AI, we might have more construct validity. So we are better approximating this problem of faithful abstraction. We're doing better on that dimension. But we're then dealing with the benevolent dictator issue. And so then that might be undermining our agency in the process.
Right. I guess back to that idea of moral mutability as well. We want to be able to change our moral thinking, and this kind of locks us in a certain sense.
Exactly. So then there is, in fact, a trade-off between these two different kind of meta goals that we, I think, should be pursuing in AI ethics. So on the one hand, we want high construct validity, but that might, again, be irreconcilable with a lot of agency and sequential mitigation. So that's a major problem.
And actually, can you expand on that idea of construct validity? Because it was new to me before I dived into your stuff. So,
right. So construct validity is more the computer science term. Philosophers would probably say a faithful abstraction or faithful representation. And so the idea is just that when we make models and when we articulate fundamental laws and theories, we always have to abstract in some way from the social world. And so a lot of people get worried about that, because I think intuitively we all know as soon as you build a general theory, you're going to lose some of its applicability to individual instances of real life. But that might be okay, because we want theories and models to be general. And so statisticians have a neat slogan for this. Most statisticians buy into the claim, all models are wrong, and that's fine. Right? They can still be useful. And so my question would be, well, how do we sort out when a model isn't that useful anymore, right? So where's that line where we diverge so much from social reality that the model actually loses explanatory power? I would also add here that very often when people think about things like construct validity, so like getting a really fine-grained picture of the real world, people forget that looking at the real world might just reproduce injustices as well, right? And so this is another important trade-off. So computer scientists have talked a lot about this. If I have a really well-calibrated algorithmic system, it'll just regurgitate exactly the kinds of social stratifications that we already have. So again, this is why our intervention is so important, because we can choose which realities we want to represent, right? Like which constructs do we want to abstract and idealize and thereby reproduce. And so maintaining an awareness of the fact that there's often multiple stories that I can tell about a person or a group or a society, and selecting the right story to tell there, I think that's really crucial. So there's a kind of standard philosophical example for this from Plato. So Plato was thinking a lot about idealizations and whether idealizations correspond to reality. And so he gives the example of a Greek statue. So in ancient Greece, statues were built kind of top heavy, so with a bigger head and bigger shoulders and so on, because you look at them from below, right? So your ordinary perspective as a spectator requires that we actually distort the statue in order for it to give us a realistic image. And so it's an idealization, but it's not the only idealization we could come up with, because of course we could have, reproduced statues in exactly human proportions, but then that would have seemed really alienating and distorting to spectators. So I think that's a really good example of thinking about different ways of representing reality and the implications of making those decisions.
That's really interesting, and it also invites, I guess, some thoughts about the idea of sort of free will versus determinism too. When you're talking about, you mentioned earlier, you said like we have the choice to decide, what our abstractions are, to decide what the world looks like to our model. if these models get really good, at a certain point, they'll be able, in fact, in many cases, they do predict our behavior better than we could. I know I've had, Duolingo will ping me every once in a while and tell me it's about time for a lesson. And I go, yeah, you know what? It's about time for a lesson. So to some degree, I guess there's this playoff. It definitely is uncomfortable when your behavior is predicted better than you might be able to. Is there a way of sort of splicing reality at its joints there? It's sort of like deciding where it makes sense to say, okay, let's treat this system as deterministic, but let's make room for free will explicitly. Maybe you want to speak to as well. There's an example you drew on from an exam, I think in the UK, that was contested recently, because maybe I'll park the thought there and let you take it from there.
Right, so the UK case that you mentioned was really, really interesting. Essentially, the UK government decided, because of COVID-19, that they were just going to cancel final exams for high school students. And instead, what they were going to do was just make predictions about which final grades high school students would get. And in the UK, that really determines your entire life, including which university you get to go to. So their system is you apply way before you finish high school, and then you get a kind of initial prediction about your grades from your teacher. And if you meet those predictions with the final exam, then you actually get to take up your place at uni. And so in this case, unfortunately, the UK decided to use a really crude statistical model that predicted grades well for people who went to private schools that had a really strong historical track record of high educational achievement. So we have reliable long-term data about these private schools. And so the model worked well there, but it really didn't work well for people who had like a large range of different grades, who were kind of middle-ranked students. It also worked terribly for people who are in schools that used to be quite low achievement schools, but that have rapidly improved in the recent past. So de facto, the model ends up disadvantaging working class students, students of color. And so it had these massively unjust outcomes where somebody who would have gotten a B suddenly failed their A levels because of different idiosyncrasies of the model. The model didn't really take into account uncertainty enough. And so really made blunt predictions where allowing for flexibility would have been much more apt and would have been a better representation of educational attainment. So in this case, it seems really misguided to use these kinds of predictions. So even if that model actually had been very accurate, which it wasn't, but assume for a moment that we could have a really good model, you might think, well, maybe you want to have the opportunity to put yourself through that final exam process. Yes, it's going to be extremely stressful, but many students articulated this feeling of, I really worked hard for this, and this was my chance to actually prove to people that I can do it. Like I've invested all of this time and energy into it. And the whole point of it is to go through that stress and to really try my best. And so, I mean, you had like kids on the street during the COVID-19 outbreak with signs saying, let's ditch this algorithm. I want to actually do this exam. And so I think that really shows us that very often the mere prediction isn't what we're trying to get at. Like we want the experience. And whenever we want the experience and the kind of the hard human process, that's where I think we can't really replace these kinds of processes. The trouble is, I think it's going to be really difficult to predict which areas of life that's going to apply to. And I also think people are going to dramatically disagree on that. So I don't think there's a really neat principled solution to this problem. I think we need a process of ongoing political arguing about that, because otherwise we're going to end up imposing a policy on people that basically says, well, in this area of your life, you're allowed to have agency, and in this area of your life, we don't really care about your free will. We're just going to, give you that prediction, and guess what? It's pretty accurate. So that would be unsatisfactory.
Yeah, and you can definitely understand the resentment too of like, even if, as you say, even if the algorithm were basically 100% accurate or had a wicked good F1 score or whatever value, you're like, if somebody tells you, hey, you know what, we ran the numbers, based on all this data, much of which has nothing to do with you, with features you would normally associate with yourself personally. It's features about your community, features about your family life, your upbringing, and this and that. And then we tell you, okay, well, with 99% confidence, we can tell you you're going to score between a B and a B plus here. Like that's a tough pill to swallow. In some ways, even worse, the more accurate the system gets. I mean, you can see people getting more resentful as they're being told, what their worth is to society in some sense by these systems.
Yeah, sometimes the process of quantification itself can be offensive in some ways, right? Like sometimes getting ever more fine-grained in our assessment of what it means to be somebody isn't actually what we want. Sometimes I think we want to take a step back and not care about certain granular details and kind of marginal differences between people. Again, obviously, philosophers have a concept for that because I guess we label each tiny idea that we have. In this context, the concept that comes to mind for me is this notion of opacity respect. So opacity respect basically means that with some kinds of questions, we don't want to look too closely at differences between people because we just decide these differences might not be relevant for our decision about what we owe to that kind of person or how we should distribute certain benefits and burdens in society. Sometimes we don't actually need to know everything about somebody in order to treat them respectfully. And so it might undermine respect if we ask too many questions, how good are you actually at this? Or have you actually thought about this? Or, these kinds of questions, especially when it comes to allocating responsibilities and rights to people, can often be undermining.
Yeah, it really makes me think of, there's a whole body obviously of moral philosophy around free will, and this question that if you have somebody who's just an absolute psychopath and they go around murdering people, you feel entitled to be very angry with them, but then later you discover that they have a brain tumor, and that brain tumor completely explains everything that they did. All of a sudden they've done a 180 from being this just absolute monster to being someone who's really worthy of a lot of sympathy, and you should just feel bad for the person. Sometimes uncovering more and more, like, I guess we're comfortable with the idea that, a cancer or something like that, a tumor, is something we'd want to know about. But then there's a continuum where you start pushing that much further and you start to go, oh, okay, well, Jeremie just said that horribly obnoxious thing because, neuron number 25 is connected to neuron number 47 this way. So it's really purely deterministic. Like it's not his fault. It's just the way his brain is. But at a certain point, these things start to get very uncomfortable.
Right, I think that's right. I mean, one concern is intrusiveness in this area, and intrusiveness can be disrespectful. But I also think that very often it's just unhelpful to find more information about somebody, because very often we're just interested in a question of blameworthiness and responsibility. And we can answer questions about responsibility and blameworthiness without having a really hyper detailed explanation of just why, this person just said this terribly obnoxious thing. So in many domains, we just want to say, look, you did this thing. We don't really care why, but, can you just apologize? It did some harm, and we're going to hold you accountable for that. So I think that's a kind of common view that we would have about people. And I think we're going to have it in an AI context as well. So information as such doesn't really tell us much. It's more about what type of information we're working with and what we do with that.
And as you've pointed out too in the past, like I guess doing this algorithmically also causes us to have a little too much confidence in the outputs of these systems. Like we start to go, oh, if the algorithm says that this person's morally responsible, then no question, we don't need trial by jury, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a well-studied psychological phenomenon called automation bias, and that is definitely something that we have to grapple with. We, as humans, just have this bias that when we're dealing with a quantified story about something, we're more likely to trust that quantified story because we think, well, as soon as something is measurable, it makes it more tangible and more objective. Perhaps even impartial, because we kind of think, well, if it's just numbers, like there can be some agenda behind it, there can be a bias behind it. And so that is dangerous thinking. I mean, obviously we got to be open to the idea that some modes of quantifying something are indeed impartial, but it doesn't go without saying that all forms of quantification are. That's something to always have at the forefront of our minds, and I think especially important for tech practitioners who have to make these daily judgment calls about how much trust they should place in the system.
Yeah, I guess it's almost like the fact that the machine learning engineer gets to, they kind of make these meta decisions, as you've alluded to, by choosing architecture, by choosing levels of abstraction and engineering features, and then they make those choices, then they move away, and that creates the illusion that no choices were ever made because the system is just sort of running on its own. Whereas if you had humans doing it, it's like, no, every instance the person is re-engineering features, redeploying their judgment. Yeah, it's sort of an interesting world we're headed to.
Yes, and I think the main thing is there isn't one easy solution that applies to all forms of technology and all domains. So I think we should be extremely skeptical of blanket tech optimism, but we should be equally skeptical of blanket tech pessimism or tech hostility. Because I don't think that any ethical and political argument will just apply across the board to all sorts of different applications.
Well, unfortunately, as somebody who's incapable of holding more than one thought in my head at the same time, I'm going to have to figure one out or the other. But really appreciate it. Yeah, that's it. As with all things nowadays, it seems. Thanks so much for your time, and this is just a great conversation. I do want to make sure if people want to follow you on various social media, what would be the best way to follow you?
Best way is probably on Twitter, so that's at Dr. Zimmermann with 2 N's at the end. Yeah, I'm on Twitter all the time.
Perfect. Yeah, me too, unfortunately. So a topic for another day. Great. So we'll make sure we link to that. We're going to write up a blog post to come with the podcast. People can read that as well, and we'll provide a bunch of links to your work, which is very fascinating as well. Thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on. It was a fascinating conversation.
Awesome. And